Welcome to Comics Bazaar, the channel of comics commentary and arcana. This video features the Uncanny X-Men number 161, cover dated September 1982. Now this is an interesting cover. There's no caption here, but we can very clearly see it's Professor X teamed up with Magneto, and that's quite the surprise. And in the background it is Baron von Strucker, the head of Hydra. So what on earth could be going on, and who is this woman in Professor X's arms? Well, this cover is penciled by Dave Cockrum and inked by Bob Wiacek, who is also the inker and artist team inside the comic. It marks the return of Cockrum to the title after a 2-issue hiatus or break. And what Claremont does in this particular issue is very interesting. It's a savvy piece of retroactive continuity, a retcon, which establishes that Professor X and Magneto knew each other long before X-Men number 1. So that was never on the cards previously. Indeed, if you recall back in Uncanny X-Men 149, Professor X was going through his files on Magneto, and one of the points he made was they didn't know anything about him, didn't know where he was from, didn't know his name, etc., etc. So just a year later, and Claremont is contradicting that point in 149 in order to create this retcon that makes for a richer, much richer narrative going forward in terms of the philosophical differences, ideological differences between these two old friends, Professor X and Magneto. So let's open this one up to the splash page, and Professor X has been in a catatonic state for the previous few issues. And here we see the nightmares that he's having about the X-Men and his own transformation. And then this really nice image of one of the Brood here as well. So the narrative captions make plain somehow an alien consciousness has become a part of him. His thought, his mind, his very soul are no longer quite his own. Bit by bit, second by second, this other self is stripping him of his humanity, and try as he might with all his might, he seems unable to stop it. So the title of the story is Gold Rush. It'll be very, it's intriguing to see how the title actually maps onto a narrative event later in the issue itself. And the creative team here, Chris Claremont writer, Dave Cockrum penciler. So note that Cockrum is getting penciler credit and Bob Wiacek inker rather than finishes. So those 2 months off, it seems that Cockrum has come back with a little bit more time to finish the pencils. Tom Orzechowski, letterer, and Glynis Wine, colorist, rounds out the creative team. One other little craft point here to note is the use of duo shade. So you can see the light grey and the dark grey here. So that was a craft technique in the 1980s that was popular at that time, and Wiacek using it here in the inking around Professor X's nightmarish thoughts here, and also a little bit on the scales of the Brood as well. So let's continue with the story. Outside of the Professor's mind, we see that we have the X-Men surrounding his bedside, concerned about him, of course, and Cyclops front and center there. And we have Sikorsky of the Starjammer liaising with Moira MacTaggart about Professor X's condition. And Sikorsky says that if the battle in his mind is not resolved soon, he will die. And then back to the narrative captions. For days he's lain thus on this balmy Caribbean isle, far off the beaten track in the heart of the infamous Bermuda Triangle, attended by friends and students, the latter comprising the mutant superhero team he founded so long ago, the X-Men. So this is the current base of the X-Men, an island that was raised from the sea floor by Magneto, but he abandoned it as his base at the end of Uncanny X-Men 150, so now it has been taken over by the X-Men. Now, Scott here, upset, walks away. He cuts Moira short in terms of her statement or prognosis that there's always hope. He says, spare me the homilies, Doctor. Under the circumstances, they ring a little hollow. Kitty, worried about Cyclops. Wolverine explains, he's been through this before, Kitty, with Jean Grey. It's a hard thing for a man to face, watching, waiting helplessly while someone you care for fights for their life. And Claremont could have left it at that with the dialogue, but he continues, and this is a nice bit of characterization here, because of course there's always been tension between Cyclops and Wolverine on the all new, all different X-Men team. So Wolverine continues and says, especially when you feel as deeply as Scotty does and try as hard to hide those feelings. In that way, I guess he and I are a lot alike. That's very interesting. So Scott's father, he's recently learned that Corsair is his father, Christopher Summers, suggests that he might go after his boy, and Storm asks that she allow him to go instead because she's his friend. So Corsair acquiesces to that. This is a nice page here. I like the colouring on this page by Glenn Swine, really suggesting the sunset here, the orange, the warm orange and red of the setting sun, and then the blues of the cool of the night and the purple cloud as well. That's a really nice panel there. So Storm goes out to Scott and he's saying, is she responsible for the sunset? She says, no, it's nature's handiwork. And then she says, I must confess that in some ways I prefer this isle to our old headquarters back in New York. Now that gives Scott the opportunity to actually hit a dig at Storm. He says, well, thanks to you, we may be here quite a while. So she asks for an explanation. He's picked up the Daily Bugle en route to the island. And it turns out that the recent adventure in issue 158 has had an impact on the public sentiment regarding mutants. X-Men Menace, news analysis by J. Jonah Jameson. So Storm explains our security was in jeopardy. The threat had to be dealt with quickly, permanently. The need justified the risk. So that was their infiltration of the Pentagon and their determination to remove all federal data files on the X-Men. But Scott, angry face on him here, double lid as well. Nice work, says, the X-Men's secret may be safe, Aurora, but our rep couldn't be worse. The government was already paranoid about mutants. This fiasco's made matters infinitely worse. So Storm says, are you suggesting we should have done nothing? A better way should have been found to accomplish the mission. I should have been consulted. And she retorts, I'm team leader, Scott, not you. So there has been some doubts in Storm's mind regarding her fitness as team leader. So she's a little bit sensitive about that point. And then you can see here something went wrong in the printing. And the speech balloon here, the lettering is very black and bolded here. But what he says here is, he says something along the lines of, then maybe it's time I took the old job back. So that really upsets Storm. She says, if you wish to reclaim that position, Cyclops, all you need to do is ask for it. But then he has second thoughts and feelings and he says, don't go, please. And so she turns around, and after that kind of brusque piece of conversation, he gets down to the point that he's emotionally perturbed. He couldn't help himself. He says here, I didn't mean what I said, at least not the way I said it. The words exploded out of me. I couldn't help myself any more than I could help the professor or Jean. So Scott really worried about the professor, and he thinks that all of what's happening with the professor isn't fair. And Storm's response is, no, it's not, any more than it was for my parents to be slain when I was young, or for Colossus's sister, Illyana, to have had her childhood stolen from her by the demon Belasco. That was in the previous issue. The one great truth in life, my friend, is its manifest unfairness. Wow. So that is a dark philosophical point from Storm. So the heart-to-heart continues, and Cyclops basically, the tough exterior, hides a softer interior, more emotional vulnerability, and he says to Storm, I need your help me. And she responds generously by saying, foolish man, you had but to ask. Inside, Lilandra's crying over Professor X in his catatonic state, and she says to him, we had such dreams, beloved. I will not see them turn to dust before their time. My thoughts once reached you across a universe. Hear them now. Fight, my love, live. If you need my strength, I give it gladly. But fight, Charles, fight. And the tear drops on his face. That's a really, really hard angle, oblique angle on Professor X's face there. That would be a difficult thing to draw, and Cockrum does it really well. And then there's a flashback. Well, or rather, it's deep in Professor X's unconscious and psyche, his memory. He flashes back to spring 20 years ago in the Israeli seaport city of Haifa. So here he is arriving in a safari suit. It turns out he's come from Cairo. He's there meeting an old friend, Daniel Shamron, who's a psychiatrist. And when Daniel asks him about his time in Cairo, he says, my visit had its memorable moments, as chronicled in X-Men 117. So that was where he had his encounter with the Shadow King for the first time, and also met a young Storm as well in the streets of Cairo. So the professor gets into the Jeep with his friend Daniel, and they go to this particular psychiatric hospital. And the patients of the hospital are survivors of the Holocaust, the Nazi concentration camps. And so it's a hospital filled with mental cases, traumatized by their time in the death camps. And then here's a big surprise, and here's the retcon. So Daniel has an assistant, a volunteer called Magnus here. And this is the first time that Professor X and Magneto meet. We get a nice close-up there on Magnus. This is the first time we've learned of a name for Magneto as well. And he says, according to Dr. Shamron, that's Daniel, you're a miracle worker. Hardly, says the professor. I've merely been luckier than most. And then he thinks to himself, and this is an interesting point concerning Magneto, fascinating. Magnus's mind is closed to me. He's no telepath, but his natural psychic defenses are as formidable as my own. Could he be another like me, a mutant? So that's an interesting aspect of Magneto's characterization, that he has a formidable mind, and that's one of the reasons why Professor X has never been able to use his telepathy on Magneto. And then the professor twigs that Magneto was an inmate of one of the death camps, Auschwitz particularly. That was established for the first time in Uncanny X-Men 150. And then we get to the particular case that Daniel would like the professor to consult on. This is Gabrielle Haller. Her experiences in Dachau so traumatized her that she withdrew into catatonic schizophrenia, a total retreat from reality. So her catatonic state mirrors the professor's in the present. And Daniel continues and says, she was like this when she arrived here. She hasn't improved yet. So that means that she's been like that for years. And he continues and says, we've tried every means humanly possible to bring her out of her trance, save those involving physical pain. She's suffered enough of that already. I turn to you as a last resort, Charles. So Daniel doesn't know that the professor has that is a mutant and has the power, psionic powers. And here we see, but nobody else does, that the professor enters psychically into Gabrielle's unconscious. And there we get these visual representations of her psychic barriers and defenses. At first he meets no resistance, says the narrative caption. He's enveloped in darkness, silence. All around him is barren, desolate. All awareness has fled. He presses on, moving ever deeper until he comes up against this wall, this brick wall. So this is a nice page as well, nice couple of pages actually, where we have the representation of Gabrielle's psychic defenses, these bug monsters. The professor notes to himself that they can kill him if he lets them, but also it's good that it's an indication that her mind is still intact at a lower level of her psyche. Her will is strong, he thinks also. She's putting up a good fight. I wonder, though, if she has found peace within herself, have I the right to force her to confront her past, her present? And he decides yes. And this is a key thought balloon here by the professor, because it encapsulates his life philosophy and also what's relevant to himself as well in his catatonic state in the present. Life is the greatest of gifts, the ultimate wonder. It should neither be taken nor wasted. Gabrielle must be allowed her full chance to live, to grow, to be all that she possibly can be. So energy flows from him. He breaks through the wall, and then he sees this blinding light. He remembers a line from the Bhagavad Gita, I am become death, the shadow of worlds. Then the majestic radiance fades, images form, a voice is heard. It is Gabrielle, age 10. Through her young, innocent eyes, he relives the war. She stands packed so tightly in a cattle car that the dead cannot fall, but remain on their feet, supported by those around them, till the cars are unloaded. Her grandmother dies that way, by Gabby's side. The lucky ones are gassed, Their bodies cremated, but Gabby is beautiful. The guards like her. So she survives, young in years, ancient in spirit, innocent no longer. There's an implication that the guards rape her, sexually molest her. And also look at Cockrum's design for the guards as well, like her memory of them, how they're transformed into these grotesque, tusked ogres and even demonic types. Was she wicked, evil? The child wonders that she should be punished so. She thinks of suicide but lacks the courage. She prays the guards will tire of her and send her to the gas chamber, but they never do. And it's so interesting that Claremont returns again to the theme of child sexual abuse after the implied abuse of Ileana in Belasco's dimension, where she spends her whole childhood. It seems to have been something that was in his mind at this time for some reason, and he's doing it again in relation to Gabby here and her childhood spent in the death camps. So really, really dark material for what was ostensibly a children's comic, but obviously richer than that and read by college-age students and older at this time. So then something weird happens in her psyche regarding the end point of her time in Dachau. Instead, in the last days of the war, she's dragged before the commandant, who points a magic wand at her, chants an obscene spell, and transforms her into solid gold. That is truly weird conclusion. By the way, you see Jim Lee referencing this design, the Tusk Monster Nazis, in Uncanny X-Men 275, and you also see Andy Kubert referencing it in X-Men, Adjectiveless X-Men, volume 2, issues 40 and 41 as well. So Gabrielle wakes up from her catatonic state. So the professor's intervention was a success, and Magnus and Daniel here are astounded. The professor, of course, doesn't explain how he did it. He asks that Gabrielle be put to bed, and then she's asleep. So Magnus here says that they've made a beginning, and Daniel is delighted by the success and decides to celebrate by opening some favorite mountain spring water. So the fact that that's in quotation marks makes me wonder if it's not something a bit harder than that. So Daniel says, I must say, Charles, during that session, Gabby expressed some remarkable verbal images. SS guards as demons and ogres, the crematoriums as the gates of hell. But how do you account for the last one, her transformation into a golden statue? And the professor says all her other images were grounded in reality. Logically then, so must this one. It was associated with extraordinary pain and fear. Beyond that, your guess is as good as mine. And we'll see what that turns out to be, what it's symbolic of, later in the issue. So there's somebody watching outside the slats of Daniel's office, a spy, and the spy thinks the Haller girl conscious. Interesting use of screen tone here as well. The leader must be informed at once. For years of patience are at last about to be rewarded. The prize we have sought for so long is finally within our grasp. And then he says to himself, "Seek Heil," so we know that this is a Nazi, yes? And then we have a montage here of time passing, Professor X, Magnus, and Gabrielle becoming good friends, traveling around Israel and viewing all its myriad wonders. And also the professor coming to realize that in many ways Magnus has been as deeply scarred by his experiences at Auschwitz as Gabby. And here we have a little debate between them, one of their first, where Magnus says to the professor, "Charles, you're an idealistic fool." And how many more times will he ever say that to the professor? "If mutants exist," says Magnus, "humanity will fear them, and out of that fear try to destroy them. There is only one way to guarantee the survival of Homo superior, and that is for them to hold the reins of power." So early in their friendship, they divide ideologically on the question of the relationship between Homo sapiens and Homo superior, or mutants. In the meantime, a little romance is developing between Gabrielle and the professor, and the professor realizes that she's in love with him, and he thinks to himself, or rather that she believes she's in love with him, and he thinks to himself, "But you aren't, not really." and yet your need to love and be loved is as genuine, as great as my own. She says she owes everything to him, and that the only thing she can repay him is the kiss she gives him. And the professor thinks here, I should not do this, but if it makes us both happy and brings us the solace we seek, what then is the harm? So the question is, has he violated some kind of ethical code? He recognizes that Gabrielle is in love with him because he saved her, and maybe what he's doing here is taking advantage of that, or maybe they're just human and they need solace, both of them. So suddenly, because of course this is an X-Men comic and Chris Claremont can't get away with a whole issue of emotional drama, and so Hydra attack, and basically they're after Gabrielle Haller, and it has something to do with that last memory of hers of being turned to solid gold. The professor here is grazed, his head is grazed by a bullet, but he's not otherwise injured, and the Hydra goons grab Gabrielle. She's not to be harmed. She's to be brought uninjured to their leader. They get aboard one of their craft, and then it's taken apart in an instant. The transport literally comes apart at the seams. Metal shrapnel spraying the courtyard, slaying the strike force almost to a man, while miraculously leaving the Israeli guards and patients untouched, the hospital undamaged. And who's that atop the hospital building? The professor thinks to himself, those men cut to pieces without mercy, a fate they no doubt richly deserved, but I can still hear their death screams in my mind, still feel their shock and pain and fear as their lives were abruptly snuffed out. So again, a clear moral difference between the professor and Magnus. The men deserve to die, but the professor, because of his telepathic power, is in a position to empathetically feel their human level of reaction and response to their sudden deaths. And so that marks out the difference between the professor who values life and Magneto, who's got a much harder attitude and more pragmatic attitude to affairs. So Magneto races down to the ground, sees that Charles is hurt, but Charles says, not seriously, my friend, though my head hurts like the devil. And so here both of them acknowledge what they are to each other. Magnus, what did you do to that aircraft? What had to be done? My only regret was that I was unable to act sooner. Was it necessary to slaughter them? And Magnus says, they would have done no less to us. You amaze me, Charles. When you were a soldier in Korea, did you not kill without hesitation or mercy? And the professor responds and says, I killed to survive, and the memory still sickens me. Again, that difference between the pair of them. Magnus, much more hardened figure. Good use of screen tone here as well for the shadowing and lighting of the characters. Nice combination of the screen tone and Glynis Oliver's colours. So there's a prisoner taken. Not all of the Hydra members were slain, and then the professor uses his power to read the Hydra soldier's mind and get the location of the rest of the team and where Gabrielle has been taken to. And it turns out it's 3,500 kilometers south at the foot of a majestic escarpment near Kenya's Lake Rudolph. A convoy of military vehicles stands in a defensive lager, an encampment. None know they are here, and anyone unlucky enough to find out will be executed on the spot. The men are mostly German, the cream of Hitler's SS, the dreaded Schutzstaffel. And at this point in time, the insignia they wear, the cause they follow, are largely unfamiliar to the world. So this is taking place in 1962. That will soon change as they emerge onto the international stage as the cruelest, deadliest, most ruthless and vicious criminal terrorist cartel in history. And that's Hydra. And you can see the Hydra insignia here on the side of this particular truck. So let's continue with the story. What has happened? One of them has found a cave, and this is information that has been pried from Gabrielle Haller. It turns out she's in chains there, and she was tortured in order to get the information. And so Baron von Strucker, who is the commander of Hydra, says to Gabrielle, so my pretty bird, your song has led us to the prize we've so long sought, but what is the prize? And she says, crying, "I should have died before I told you anything." Yeah, but you are weak, Gabrielle, like all your mongrel race. Because, of course, Baron von Strucker is a racist. And he says here, "Bring her. It is only fitting that she witness our moment of triumph, since she alone made it possible." And here in the background, the Professor and Magnus have trailed Hydra to their base. And they have already gotten themselves in Hydra costumes. They've left a couple of soldiers unconscious in a cave, and they follow incognito behind Strucker into this particular cave where there's a big brick wall, and Strucker blows up the wall, and it turns out what they have there is Nazi gold. And the gold is from the Fuhrer's personal gold reserve, and the purpose that Hydra are going to put it to is to attack the world's governments and institute a Fourth Reich. And so he gloats here and says, "Where our beloved Fuhrer Adolf Hitler failed, Hydra shall succeed." And this is their exclamation, "Hail Hydra." But the Professor and Magnus are there, and of course we can expect that they're going to put a spanner in the works. So, first of all, they're intent on rescuing Gabrielle, and she's gotten confused by their costumes, even though they've taken off their helmets. And von Strucker commands that they all be shot. But of course, Magneto has his powers and is able to deflect those bullets. And the Professor here realizes, most particularly, he's a mutant like myself, with the ability to manipulate metal objects. This is fantastic. But also he recognizes Gabby's mind is in turmoil. Too many shocks coming too soon after her recovery. It's more than she can handle. So he's in trouble there because he's trying to calm her, and he's trying to mentally or psionically affect the perceptions of the Hydra soldiers so that they don't see them. And he thinks here, this is a great image as well, he thinks, "But there are too many men, more minds than I can effectively control. This invisibility gambit is at best a stopgap measure. We need a diversion. I do not like consciously manipulating other people's minds, but I have no choice." And that's a fixed aspect of the Professor's character. So he sets two of these soldiers against each other using his powers. Then they all enter into a brawl, and Magnus is impressed. "A brilliant stratagem, Charles. It was necessary, but I take no satisfaction in it." So again, the difference between them coming out here in their dialogue, their different ideological perspectives on ends and means. And Magnus says, "One day, my friend, that squeamishness will cost you." So he wants to know what's wrong with Gabby. So it's she's in a catatonic state again. And the Professor here doesn't want to mind probe her, and he explains why. "She'll become dependent on my ability. The slightest shock will be capable of shattering her psyche, because she'll believe that I'll be there to put things right again." That's interesting. So he's working through it practically, but also in a kind of like an ethical manner too. He says, "But I won't be. She must develop a psychic resilience to enable her to cope with the everyday and the extraordinary stresses of life. And to do that, she must pull out of this herself. She must want to live." And that advice, or that kind of perspective he has on Gabrielle and her catatonic state, applies also to him. So he calls to her, "Do you hear me, Gabby? Come back, fight." And that echoes the words of Lilandra from the beginning of the issue, and that's important to remember. Meanwhile, Baron von Strucker hasn't been taken care of. He's got this techno gizmo, this gauntlet. He calls it the Satan Claw, which gives him tremendous power. But of course, it's nothing to Magneto. Magneto says to him, "Baron, you will find me considerably harder to slay than your countrymen did my family at Auschwitz." So he crushes his hand in the gauntlet, and he says that he's merely demonstrating his irresistible power, the ability to manipulate magnetic fields. "Your precious claw is made primarily of ferrous metals. That makes it particularly vulnerable. However, my influence is not limited to metals. By shaping natural forces, I can hurl you away with but a thought. Unfortunately, my power did not manifest itself till I reached adulthood, By then the war was over. But had I possessed it in the camps, Butcher, the tyranny of your Third Reich would have been ended overnight. So von Strucker, an ideologue, isn't listening. He says that their purposes and aims will prevail. And Magnus says, all things are possible, Nazi. Hate is more popular than love. Fear more prevalent than trust. If humanity, and again, that's Magneto's dark perspective on humanity, different from Professor X's more hopeful perspective. If humanity wishes to follow you to its damnation, so be it. I care nothing for you or them. And when Homo sapiens are no more, Homo superior will claim their rightful place as lords of the earth. So he blasts his way up through the rock of the cave, sends the professor and Gabby out using his abilities, takes all the Nazi gold as well. Strucker here, like a Silver Age villain, saying, you'll pay for this, Magnus, we'll hunt you down. And Magnus just flies up out of the cave and collapses the roof on top of von Strucker. To be perfectly honest, Baron, he says, I doubt I'll have much to fear from a ghost. So really, really cool stuff from Magneto in this particular issue. And look at all that gold there. And that is the gold rush of the title of the story. So the professor here talks about how he's reaching Gabby, but what of Strucker and his men? Magnus, what do you mean to do with that gold? Do you really need to ask, my friend, says Magnus, and he doesn't elaborate. You're far too trusting, Charles, too naive. You have faith in the essential goodness of man. In time, you will learn what I have learned, that even those you love will turn from you in horror when they discover what you truly are. Mutants will not go meekly to the gas chambers. We will fight and we will win. Farewell. And away he goes with all that gold. And we have to infer that that's what has been funding him down the years for all of his, magnificent machines and schemes. And Gabby wakes up. And what woke her up was her own self, her own resilience. She says, I remember everything, yet it feels like some fantastic dream. I was huddled behind a wall, in my mind, alone and terrified. I knew nothing could hurt me there. I'd be safe, protected forever. Then I heard your voice. I was no longer alone. If I left my hiding place, I'd risk being hurt. But I knew that if I stayed, I'd be condemning myself once again to a living death. I couldn't bear it. Scared of one choice, more scared of the other, I followed your call. And she says to him, it's so wonderful to be alive, as they're about to kiss. And that wakes the professor up from his catatonic state. And of course, it's because he heard Lilandra calling to him. And she says, delighted, everybody's delighted around his bed. I did what any other would for the one they loved. So a nice happy ending there, but there's 2 more pages at the end of this story. And it is going to tee us up for the next 4 issues. And so there's a celebratory dinner. Lilandra's Imperial yacht has arrived to take her back to the hub of the Empire, where she has to take up her duties again as Magistrix. The professor is not yet well enough to attend the dinner, but all the X-Men do. Illyana too is left out because she's also recovering from her traumatic time in Belasco's limbo. So we see the X-Men dressed in these outlandish Shi'ar costumes. Gives Dave Cockrum an opportunity to show off his design skills again. Lilandra here is toasting the X-Men. I salute you, X-Men, as warriors and friends. The Shi'ar owe you a debt. But meanwhile, Wolverine here, with his mutant-enhanced senses, is worried. We're among friends, so why am I on edge? I keep spotting traces of familiar scents, but I can't place them. What's to worry? If trouble comes, we'll handle it. So what's he sensed? Well, Lilandra's about to drink from her goblet, and then she winks out, goes into a catatonic state. What's the matter? And again, that Glynis Oliver trope, a moment of heightened emotion, shock, surprise, the red background. I always have to point that out. So last page of the issue. Who's there? What's happened? It's Deathbird. Remember her. We haven't seen her for a few issues. The last time we saw her, she reconfirmed her pact with the Brood, and so this has all been wrought by the Brood, and here they appear in the final panel, triumphing over the defeated X-Men. because they're blasted by a bomb hidden underneath the table, a stasis bomb. So Deathbird triumphant, satisfied Clan Master, she asks, "You've served the Brood well, Renegade," he says, "and so shall these X-Men. As host forms," this has all been teased in previous issues concerning the Brood, but we haven't got a full explanation of what this means, "for the spawn of our blessed ruler, the mother of us all." She's been mentioned a number of times before, but we've never seen her, and so we're going to learn much more about the Brood in the upcoming 4 issues. A journey of 1,000,000 light years begins with an escape. So there you go. The letters here have to do with issue 153, and that is it. I do hope that you enjoyed this review and commentary on this very important retcon contained in this issue, establishing an old friendship between Professor X and Magneto way prior to X-Men number 1. And what's your thoughts on that? Did you enjoy this retcon of Claremont's? Did you agree with it? Do you think that it enriches the X-Men mythos? Let me know your thoughts in the comments to this video. If you enjoyed my review and commentary, please like the video in YouTube. It really helps the channel. And if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for more content like this.